The morning started like any other Tuesday at the downtown courthouse. Judge Patricia Reynolds walked into courtroom 5B carrying her coffee and wearing the same black robe she'd worn for the past 20 years. She was 56 years old and had seen it all. Or at least that's what she thought. Patricia had a reputation. Some lawyers called her fair but tough. Others whispered that she was impatient and quick to judge. Either way, everyone knew not to waste her time. She ran her courtroom like a tight ship, and she expected everyone to follow the rules. As she sat down behind the big wooden desk at the front of the room, her clerk handed her the morning's schedule. She scanned through the list of cases, barely reading the names. Traffic violations, small disputes, a few criminal matters. Nothing unusual. Then her eyes stopped on one case that made her raise an eyebrow. The case was about someone practicing law without a license. That was serious business. The legal system didn't take kindly to people pretending to be lawyers. She'd handled cases like this before, and they usually involved con artists trying to scam desperate people out of their money. The bailiff called out the case number, and the courtroom doors opened. What happened next made Judge Reynolds actually pause mid-sip of her coffee. A young man walked in, and he looked like he should be in high school, not a courtroom. He couldn't have been more than 15 or 16 years old. His black hair was slightly messy, like he'd just rolled out of bed. And his suit? It was clearly too big for him. The sleeves hung past his hands, and he kept pushing them up as he walked. The shoulders sagged, and the whole outfit looked like something borrowed from an older relative. A few people in the courtroom started whispering. One lawyer in the back row actually chuckled. Even the court reporter glanced up with a confused look on her face. Judge Reynolds put down her coffee and leaned forward. "Okay, what's going on here?" she said, not even trying to hide the annoyance in her voice. "Is this some kind of prank?" "Where's your attorney, young man? And where are your parents?" The young man walked calmly to the defense table. He didn't look nervous at all, which only made the situation more bizarre. He placed a small briefcase on the table and turned to face the judge with a respectful but confident expression. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said in a clear voice. "My name is David Chen. I'm representing myself today. And just to clarify, I'm 32 years old." The courtroom erupted. Several people laughed out loud. One lawyer shook his head like he'd heard everything now. Even the prosecutor, a serious man in his 40s named Daniel Hoffman, cracked a smile. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel hard on the desk. Order in this court." She turned her attention back to David, and her expression was a mix of irritation and disbelief. "Young man, I don't appreciate jokes in my courtroom. This is a serious matter. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is your lawyer?" David remained calm. He didn't raise his voice or show any frustration. "Your Honor, with all respect, I am a lawyer. I have my bar card right here and my driver's license that shows my date of birth." He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the bench. The bailiff, a large man who'd worked in the courthouse for years, stepped forward and took the documents from David. He carried them to Judge Reynolds, who snatched them up and examined them closely. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the bar card. It said David Chen, licensed to practice law in the state, admitted in 2019. The driver's license showed a birth date that would make him 32 years old. But looking at the young man standing in front of her, it seemed impossible. "This has to be fake," Judge Reynolds said, though there was a tiny crack of uncertainty in her voice. "These documents must be forged. Bailiff, I want you to call the state bar right now and verify these credentials." The bailiff nodded and stepped out of the courtroom with his phone. Meanwhile, the prosecutor stood up, still looking amused by the whole situation. "Your Honor," Daniel Hoffman began, "the defendant is accused of practicing law without a proper license. 3 months ago, he supposedly represented a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez in a housing case. The client thought she was hiring a real attorney. Instead, she got this." He gestured toward David with a wave of his hand. "Someone who clearly isn't what he claims to be." David opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak," she said sharply. "I don't care what kind of fake documents you've managed to create. Just looking at you is disruptive to this entire proceeding. This courtroom has standards." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One older woman in the third row frowned, looking like she wanted to say something but didn't dare interrupt the judge. David stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just waited with the same calm, patient expression he'd had since walking through the door. 20 minutes passed. The courtroom was quiet except for the occasional cough or shuffle of papers. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen when the bailiff returned. Finally, the door opened and the bailiff walked back in. He approached the judge's bench with a puzzled look on his face that made everyone lean forward in their seats. "Your Honor," the bailiff said slowly, "I just spoke with the State Bar Verification Department. They confirmed that David Chen is indeed a licensed attorney in good standing. They also mentioned something else." He paused. "He graduated from Yale Law School at age 22 and passed the bar exam on his first try with one of the highest scores they'd seen in years." The courtroom went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Reynolds' face went pale, then slowly turned red. The prosecutor's smile vanished. And David Chen just stood there waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Reynolds sat frozen in her chair, staring at the documents in front of her. The bar card, the driver's license, and now this confirmation from the state bar itself. Everything was real. This young-looking man standing in her courtroom really was a licensed attorney. And not just any attorney, but apparently a brilliant one. She cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Her face was still flushed with embarrassment, but she wasn't about to admit she'd made a mistake. Not yet, anyway. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "just because the state bar says you're licensed doesn't explain everything. The complaint states that you deceived your client about your qualifications. Mrs. Rodriguez believed she was hiring an experienced attorney, not someone who looks like he just got out of middle school." A few people in the courtroom glanced at each other uncomfortably. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. David remained standing at the defense table, completely composed. If he was angry or hurt by the judge's comments, he didn't show it. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Your Honor, may I present evidence?" he asked politely. Judge Reynolds waved her hand dismissively. "Go ahead." David walked forward and handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "What you'll find there is an affidavit from Mrs. Rodriguez herself. She submitted it yesterday specifically for this hearing. In it, she explains very clearly that she knew exactly who I was when she hired me. She knew my age, she knew about my appearance, and she chose me anyway." The prosecutor, Daniel Hoffman, suddenly looked less confident. He stood up, tugging at his tie. "Your Honor, I was given information by the opposing counsel in the Rodriguez case. If there's been some kind of miscommunication—" "A miscommunication?" David interrupted, his voice still calm but with a hint of steel underneath. "Mr. Hoffman, the complaint didn't come from my client. It came from Harold Martinez, the lawyer I went up against in that case. And it came right after I won a $40,000 settlement for Mrs. Rodriguez." Judge Reynolds looked up sharply from the affidavit she was reading. "What are you suggesting?" David pulled out another document from his briefcase. "I'm suggesting that Mr. Martinez has a pattern of filing false complaints against attorneys who defeat him in court. Specifically, attorneys who look young. This is the third time he's done this in the past 2 years. I have documentation of the other cases right here." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. This was turning into something much bigger than anyone had expected. Judge Reynolds held up her hand for silence, then read through Mrs. Rodriguez's affidavit more carefully. The woman had written several paragraphs about her experience. She described how she'd been facing eviction from her apartment of 20 years. The landlord was trying to force her out so he could renovate and charge higher rent. She'd gone to 5 different law firms and they'd all turned her down. They said her case wasn't worth enough money for them to take it on. Then she'd heard about David Chen through a friend. She'd met with him, and yes, she was surprised by how young he looked. But when he explained her legal options and showed her his track record of winning similar cases, she decided to trust him. And he'd delivered. Not only did he prevent her eviction, but he also uncovered multiple housing code violations and proof of illegal eviction attempts. The settlement covered her moving expenses to a better apartment and gave her enough money to live comfortably for years. At the end of the affidavit, Mrs. Rodriguez had written, "Mr. Chen saved my life. I don't care if he looks like he's 16 or 60. He's the only lawyer who treated me with dignity and fought for me when no one else would." Judge Reynolds set down the paper slowly. She removed her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. For a moment, she looked every one of her 56 years. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "it appears I may have jumped to conclusions. With respect, Your Honor, David replied, this isn't just about today. This is about something that happens to me constantly. I have a medical condition called developmental neoteny. Basically, my body ages much more slowly than normal. I'm completely healthy, but I'll probably look like a teenager until I'm 50 or 60 years old. He pulled out a tablet from his briefcase. I'd like to show you something if the court will allow it. Judge Reynolds nodded, looking curious now rather than hostile. David approached the bench with the bailiff's permission and turned the tablet so the judge could see the screen. For the past 5 years, I've been documenting every instance where my appearance has caused problems in my legal career. What you're about to see isn't just 1 or 2 isolated incidents. It's a pattern. He started scrolling through files, and Judge Reynolds' expression changed with each one. There were recordings, transcripts, and even videos from courtrooms where cameras were allowed. In case after case, David had been treated with contempt, suspicion, or outright mockery before he'd even had a chance to speak. There was the judge who refused to let him represent a client until 3 other lawyers vouched for him. The opposing counsel who called him kid throughout an entire trial and told him to go home and let the adults handle this. The court clerk who tried to have him removed from a courthouse because she assumed he was a lost teenager. In every single case, David had remained professional. He never lost his temper. He never stooped to their level. And in almost every case, he won. 47 incidents, David said softly. That's how many times I've documented prejudicial treatment based on my appearance. 12 times judges initially refused to let me represent clients. 23 times opposing lawyers filed baseless complaints just like Mr. Martinez did. And I've lost count of how many times I've been mocked or dismissed before even opening my mouth. Judge Reynolds was silent, staring at the screen. Prosecutor Hoffman had sat down and was looking at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. The law is supposed to be blind, David continued. It's supposed to judge people on facts and evidence, not on what they look like. But time and time again, I've watched justice delayed because people can't see past my appearance. Today was supposed to be just another example of that. He turned off the tablet and looked directly at Judge Reynolds. But maybe, just maybe, today can be different. Maybe instead of just dismissing these charges and moving on, we can actually learn something from this. The judge sat back in her chair, her gavel resting forgotten on the desk beside her. The confident, no-nonsense judge who had started the morning was gone. In her place was someone who looked shaken and uncertain, and everyone in that courtroom knew that what happened next would matter. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was waiting to see what Judge Reynolds would say next. She sat there for what felt like forever, just staring at the papers in front of her. Her hands were shaking slightly and she clasped them together to hide it. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Chen, I need to be honest with you. When you walked into my courtroom this morning, I made a judgment about you in about 3 seconds. I saw a kid in an oversized suit and I decided you couldn't possibly be a real attorney. I didn't wait for evidence. I didn't listen to what you had to say. I just decided. David nodded but didn't interrupt. He could tell the judge was struggling with something and he wanted to let her finish. I've been on the bench for 20 years, she continued, her voice quieter now. 20 years. And in all that time I've prided myself on being fair. I've told myself that I treat everyone equally, that I judge cases on their merits, not on appearances or assumptions. But today you've shown me that I've been lying to myself. A woman in the back of the courtroom wiped her eyes. Even some of the lawyers who had been smirking earlier now looked uncomfortable. Prosecutor Hoffman stood up, straightening his jacket. Your Honor, if I may speak, I think we all owe Mr. Chen an apology. I came into this courtroom ready to prosecute what I thought was a clear-cut case of fraud. I was given information by Mr. Martinez's office and I didn't question it. I should have done my due diligence before bringing charges. He turned to face David. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry. This case should never have been brought to court in the first place. David acknowledged the apology with a slight nod. I appreciate that, Mr. Hoffman. But this isn't just about today or just about me. This is about a system that allows this to keep happening. He walked to the center of the courtroom, addressing not just the judge but everyone present. I didn't document all those incidents because I wanted to embarrass anyone or get revenge. I did it because I knew that one day I'd need proof. People don't believe stories about discrimination unless you can show them concrete evidence. He held up his tablet again. Every case in here represents someone who couldn't see past what I looked like. But here's the thing that really bothers me. I'm lucky. I have credentials from Yale. I have a perfect bar exam score. I have 5 years of winning cases. Eventually, people listen to me because my record speaks for itself. David's voice grew more passionate, though he still kept his composure. But what about the people who don't have those credentials? What about the brilliant young lawyers who went to state schools instead of Ivy League universities? What about the talented attorneys who had to take the bar exam twice or who don't have a photographic memory and top scores? If I face this kind of prejudice with all my advantages, what happens to them? An older lawyer in the second row nodded slowly. He was probably in his 60s, and he looked like he was really thinking about what David was saying. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. What are you proposing, Mr. Chen? What do you want to happen here? David took a deep breath. I want change. Real change. Not just dismissing this case and pretending it never happened. I want the legal system to acknowledge that this is a problem and actually do something about it. He tapped on his tablet and pulled up another file. I've spent the last 2 years developing a training program. It's designed for judges, lawyers, court staff, everyone who works in the legal system. It teaches people how to recognize their own biases and how to make decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. The bailiff had moved closer to see what was on the screen. Even he looked interested now. The program uses real examples, David explained. Not just cases involving appearance, but all kinds of unconscious bias. Race, gender, age, disability, accent, clothing, everything. Because the truth is we all have biases. Every single one of us. The question isn't whether we have them. The question is whether we're willing to admit it and work on fixing them. Judge Reynolds stood up from her chair, which surprised everyone. Judges usually stayed seated during proceedings. She walked down from the bench and approached David, looking at the tablet screen. Show me, she said simply. For the next 15 minutes, David walked the judge through his program. It included video examples, interactive scenarios, and real data about how bias affects legal outcomes. He showed her studies about how judges give harsher sentences before lunch when they're hungry. He showed her research about how people with certain names get treated differently, even when all other factors are identical. The prosecutor came over to look too. Then a few of the lawyers from the gallery. Before long, there was a small crowd gathered around David's tablet, all of them engaged in what he was showing them. One of the lawyers, a woman in her 40s, spoke up. I've seen this happen, not just with young-looking people, but with women attorneys too. I can't tell you how many times I've been mistaken for a secretary or a paralegal, even when I'm lead counsel on a case. Another lawyer chimed in. I have a strong accent. English is my third language. I've had opposing counsel actually ask the judge if they needed an interpreter for me, just to make me look incompetent in front of the jury. The stories started flowing. It was like David had opened a door that everyone had been afraid to walk through. People shared experiences of being underestimated, dismissed, or judged unfairly based on something that had nothing to do with their abilities as attorneys. Judge Reynolds returned to the bench, but her whole demeanor had changed. She wasn't the stern, impatient judge from the beginning of the day anymore. She looked like someone who had just realized something important about herself and didn't like what she'd found. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice carrying across the now buzzing courtroom, I want to make you an offer, but first I need to formally address the case at hand. She picked up her gavel and banged it once. The room fell silent again. After reviewing the evidence presented today, it is clear that the charges against David Chen are completely without merit. Not only is he a licensed attorney in good standing, but the complaint was filed in bad faith by opposing counsel. Therefore, I am dismissing all charges with prejudice. A few people in the gallery clapped, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand. I'm not finished, she said. Mr. Chen, I'd like to request your help. Our state has a judicial education program that all judges are required to attend annually. Right now it's boring, outdated, and frankly not very effective. I want to propose that we bring your training program into that system, and I want to be the first judge to go through it. David's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time all day that he'd looked genuinely surprised. I can't undo what I did this morning, Judge Reynolds continued. I can't take back the assumptions I made or the way I treated you. But maybe I can help make sure it happens less often in the future. What do you say? Every eye in the courtroom turned to David, waiting to hear his answer. David stood there for a moment, looking at Judge Reynolds. Everyone in the courtroom was holding their breath, waiting for his answer. This was the moment that would define everything that had happened that morning. Your Honor, David said slowly. 6 months ago, I would have said no to an offer like that. I was angry. Every time someone treated me like a child, every time someone questioned my credentials, every time someone laughed at me in a courtroom, I got a little angrier. I started thinking that maybe the system was too broken to fix. He paused, and the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. But then something changed. I represented a teenager, a real one, who was being tried as an adult for a crime he didn't commit. He was 17, scared out of his mind, and the prosecutor kept calling him a dangerous criminal based on nothing but his age and the neighborhood he came from. When I stood up to defend him, the judge actually listened to me. Not at first, but eventually. And we won that case. David's voice got a little stronger. That judge came up to me afterward and told me something I'll never forget. She said, "I almost didn't take you seriously when you walked in here, but I'm glad I gave you a chance because you just saved that kid's life." And you know what? She was right. If she had let her bias win, an innocent teenager would be in prison right now. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding where this was going. "So yes," David continued, "I'll help. I'll work with your judicial education program. Because even though what happened this morning was hard, you're willing to change. And that's all I've ever wanted. Not perfection, just people willing to try." The courtroom erupted in applause. Even the bailiff was clapping. Judge Rain, a few people in the gallery clapped, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand. "I'm not finished," she said. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to request your help. Our state has a judicial education program that all judges are required to attend annually. Right now it's boring, outdated, and frankly not very effective. I want to propose that we bring your training program into that system, and I want to be the first judge to go through it." David's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time all day that he'd looked genuinely surprised. "I can't undo what I did this morning," Judge Reynolds continued. "I can't take back the assumptions I made or the way I treated you. But maybe I can help make sure it happens less often in the future. What do you say?" Every eye in the courtroom turned to David, waiting to hear his answer. David stood there for a moment, looking at Judge Reynolds. Everyone in the courtroom was holding their breath, waiting for his answer. This was the moment that would define everything that had happened that morning. "Your Honor," David said slowly. 6 months ago, I would have said no to an offer like that. I was angry. Every time someone treated me like a child, every time someone questioned my credentials, every time someone laughed at me in a courtroom, I got a little angrier. I started thinking that maybe the system was too broken to fix. He paused, and the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. But then something changed. I represented a teenager, a real one, who was being tried as an adult for a crime he didn't commit. He was 17, scared out of his mind, and the prosecutor kept calling him a dangerous criminal based on nothing but his age and the neighborhood he came from. When I stood up to defend him, the judge actually listened to me. Not at first, but eventually. And we won that case. David's voice got a little stronger. That judge came up to me afterward and told me something I'll never forget. She said, "I almost didn't take you seriously when you walked in here, but I'm glad I gave you a chance because you just saved that kid's life." And you know what? She was right. If she had let her bias win, an innocent teenager would be in prison right now. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding where this was going. "So yes," David continued, "I'll help. I'll work with your judicial education program. Because even though what happened this morning was hard, you're willing to change. And that's all I've ever wanted." Newell smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her all day. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," she said. "I won't let you down." Prosecutor Hoffman stood up again. "Your Honor, I'd like to add something. I think the state attorney's office should also participate in this training. And furthermore, I'm going to personally recommend that we investigate Harold Martinez for filing false complaints. This kind of behavior has no place in our legal system." Judge Reynolds banged her gavel in agreement. "Noted and approved. Mr. Hoffman, please keep this court informed of your findings." As the formal proceeding wrapped up, something unexpected happened. The lawyers who had been sitting in the gallery started approaching David. They weren't just curious anymore. They wanted to talk. The woman who had mentioned being mistaken for a secretary introduced herself as Linda Park. "I've been practicing law for 18 years," she told David, "and I still face this stuff constantly. Just last month, a client asked to speak to the real lawyer because he assumed I was just there to take notes. A younger man, maybe in his late 20s, joined the conversation. I'm Robert Torres. I passed the bar 2 years ago, and I've thought about quitting at least a dozen times. Not because the work is hard, but because I'm tired of proving myself over and over again just because I look young." David listened to each of them, nodding with understanding. He'd heard these stories before because he'd lived versions of them himself. An older gentleman approached, the one who had been nodding earlier. "I'm Judge William Foster, retired," he said, extending his hand. "I served on the bench for 35 years, and I'm ashamed to say I probably made the same mistakes Judge Reynolds made today. The difference is nobody ever called me out on it. I wish someone had." Judge Reynolds had stepped down from the bench and joined the group. "Bill, you don't need to say that here." "Yes, I do," Judge Foster insisted, "because staying silent is part of the problem. We need to talk about these things openly. That's the only way anything changes." David looked around at all these people, from different backgrounds and different stages of their careers, all united by the realization that the system they worked in wasn't as fair as they'd thought. It was exactly what he'd been hoping for, but it was still overwhelming to see it actually happen. Judge Reynolds pulled out her phone. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to set up a meeting with the head of the Judicial Education Board. Can you come in next week to present your program?" "I can do that," David replied. "Good, and I want you to bring everything. All your documentation, all your research, all your ideas for how to make this better. Don't hold back." Over the next hour, the courtroom turned into an impromptu meeting. People exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. Lawyers talked about forming a committee to address bias in the legal profession. Judge Foster offered to mentor younger attorneys who were struggling with discrimination. Even the court reporter mentioned that she'd noticed patterns in how different people were treated and wanted to help document them. Prosecutor Hoffman pulled David aside. "I meant what I said about investigating Martinez, but I want to go further than that. How many other attorneys has he filed complaints against?" David pulled up a file on his tablet. "Including me, 4 in the past 2 years. All of them were young-looking or young, and all of them had just beaten him in court. Did any of those complaints stick? No, they were all dismissed eventually. But the process is the punishment, you know? Each person had to hire their own attorney, spend time and money defending themselves, deal with the stress. One of them, a woman named Jennifer Wu, actually left the legal profession because of it. She said she couldn't handle the constant attacks." Hoffman's jaw tightened. "Give me their names. I want to interview all of them. If there's a pattern here, and it sounds like there is, Martinez is going to face serious consequences. I'll send you everything I have," David promised. As people started to leave the courtroom, several of them stopped to shake David's hand or thank him. One young lawyer who couldn't have been more than a year out of law school had tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was the only one who felt like this. I thought maybe I just wasn't cut out for this job. But hearing everyone's stories today, realizing it's not just me, it helps, it really helps." David squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone, and you're exactly cut out for this job. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Judge Reynolds was the last one to leave. She stood by the doorway watching David pack up his briefcase. "You know," she said, "I've been a judge for 20 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of case there was. But this morning taught me more than any case I've ever presided over." David looked up at her. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially in front of a whole courtroom. Not many people would do that." "I didn't feel courageous," she admitted. "I felt embarrassed and ashamed. But I guess that's part of growth, right? Feeling uncomfortable?" "Usually, yeah," David said with a small smile. "The uncomfortable moments are where the real learning happens." Judge Reynolds extended her hand and David shook it. "I'll see you next week, Mr. Chen, and thank you for not giving up on us." As David walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, his 2 big suit sleeves hanging over his hands, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, genuine hope that things might actually get better. 3 months passed since that morning in courtroom 5B, and the changes were bigger than anyone could have imagined. David sat in a conference room at the State Judicial Center, watching as 50 judges from across the state filed in for the mandatory bias training session. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. A few looked downright annoyed at having to be there. Judge Reynolds stood at the front of the room. She'd volunteered to introduce the program, and David could tell she was nervous. She kept fidgeting with her notes. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "I know some of you are wondering why we're here today. You might be thinking this is just another boring training session that you have to sit through. I thought the same thing 3 months ago." She paused and looked directly at the assembled judges. "But then something happened that changed my perspective completely. I made a terrible mistake in my courtroom, and a young attorney named David Chen had the courage to call me out on it. Not with anger or accusations, but with facts and evidence. And today he's going to share with you what he shared with me." David stood up and walked to the front. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, and he knew exactly what most of them were thinking. Even now, even after everything, some of these judges were probably wondering why they were taking advice from someone who looked like a high school student. "Thank you, Judge Reynolds," he said calmly. "I'm going to start with a question. How many of you have ever made a snap judgment about someone based on their appearance?" A few hands went up hesitantly, then a few more. Eventually, almost everyone in the room had raised their hand. "Good," David said, "because if you hadn't raised your hand, I would have known you were lying. Every human being makes snap judgments. Our brains are wired to do it. It's not about being a bad person. It's about being human." He could see some of the skeptical judges starting to relax a little. "The problem isn't that we have biases," David continued. "The problem is when we let those biases make decisions for us. When we stop questioning our own assumptions. When we see what we expect to see instead of what's actually in front of us." For the next 2 hours, David walked them through his program. He showed them real cases where bias had affected outcomes. He showed them research about how even small things like the time of day or whether a judge had eaten lunch could influence their decisions. He showed them practical techniques for recognizing their own biases and making more objective choices. But the most powerful part came when he shared stories. Not just his own, but stories from dozens of attorneys who had experienced discrimination. Stories about brilliant lawyers who almost quit because they were tired of fighting just to be taken seriously. Stories about clients who didn't get proper representation because their attorney was dismissed based on appearance. One judge, an older woman named Patricia Ellis, raised her hand. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate what you're saying, but I've been on the bench for 28 years. I like to think I'm pretty fair. How do I know if I'm making these mistakes?" David smiled. "That's exactly the right question to ask. And the answer is, you probably are making them. We all are. But here's the good news. Research shows that just being aware of our biases reduces their impact by about 40%. Just knowing that you might be making assumptions makes you question those assumptions." He pulled up a slide showing a simple technique. Before you make any ruling, especially in cases where you have a strong initial reaction, ask yourself 3 questions. 1. What assumptions am I making? 2. What evidence supports those assumptions? 3. What evidence contradicts those assumptions? It takes about 30 seconds and it can make a huge difference. Judge Ellis nodded thoughtfully, writing down the questions. After the training ended, several judges stayed to talk with David. They asked questions, shared their own experiences, and some even admitted to mistakes they'd made in the past. But the real test came in the weeks and months that followed. Judge Reynolds started asking those 3 questions before every ruling. She noticed patterns in her own thinking that she'd never seen before. In one case, she caught herself assuming that a well-dressed defendant was more trustworthy than a poorly dressed one, even though there was no evidence to support that. She corrected course and made her decision based on the actual facts. The investigation into Harold Martinez concluded with serious consequences. Prosecutor Huffman had interviewed all 4 attorneys who had been targeted by false complaints. The pattern was undeniable. Martinez was disbarred for filing fraudulent complaints and abusing legal process. 2 of the attorneys he had targeted, including Jennifer Wu, who had left the profession, received formal apologies and compensation. Jennifer actually reached out to David after the news broke. "I never thought I'd practice law again," she told him over coffee. But knowing that someone finally stood up to Martinez and that the system actually held him accountable, it makes me want to try again. "You should," David encouraged her. "The profession needs people like you. People who care enough to be hurt when the system fails. 6 months after the training program launched, the results started coming in. Surveys showed that judges who had gone through the program were more consistent in their rulings. Appeals based on judicial bias had decreased by 18%. And perhaps most importantly, younger attorneys and attorneys from diverse backgrounds reported feeling more respected in courtrooms. Robert Torres, the young lawyer who had thought about quitting, sent David a message. "Just won my biggest case yet. The judge actually complimented my legal strategy instead of questioning my credentials. Small victory, but it felt huge." David saved that message along with dozens of others like it. One afternoon, David returned to courtroom 5B for a new case. As he walked in with his briefcase and his still-too-big suit, he noticed something different. The court clerk smiled at him in recognition. The bailiff nodded respectfully, and when Judge Reynolds entered, she greeted him professionally without a trace of the condescension from that first day. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she said. "I see you're representing the plaintiff in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor," David replied. "Very well. Let's proceed." It was such a simple interaction, so ordinary and unremarkable, but that was exactly what made it meaningful. David wasn't being treated as an exception or a curiosity. He was just another attorney doing his job. After the hearing, which David won, Judge Reynolds called him to the bench. "I wanted you to know," she said quietly, "that your training program has been adopted by 3 other states. They reached out asking how we implemented it, and I told them it all started with one attorney who refused to accept 'that's just how things are' as an answer." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for telling me that, Your Honor." "No," she said firmly. "Thank you for giving us a chance to do better." As David left the courthouse that day, he thought about how far things had come. The system wasn't perfect. There were still judges who made assumptions, still lawyers who faced discrimination, still clients who didn't get fair treatment. Change was slow and incomplete, but it was happening. One courtroom, one judge, one case at a time, things were getting better. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Not perfection, but progress. Not an end to bias, but people willing to recognize it and fight against it. David pulled out his phone and added one more note to his documentation. Not about discrimination this time, but about hope. About what happens when people choose growth over ego. When they admit mistakes instead of defending them. When they work together instead of staying divided. He titled the note simply, "Why I Still Believe in the Law." Then he closed his briefcase, adjusted his 2 big sleeves one more time, and headed to his next case. There was still work to do, but for the first time in years he felt like he wasn't doing it alone.